Greetings, viewers around the world. In the wake of Donald Trump's historic election to the presidency, protests have erupted in more than 30 cities in the United States. They erupted on the second night following the election as the results of the election began to sink in. They erupted again on the second night, and now it's Friday night, and there is a threat that they're going to erupt some more. People are not accepting the fact that Donald Trump has been elected to the presidency. It's something that they considered impossible because of various statements he's made, negative, or so it appears, toward Latinos, and apparently accusations of being a misogynist and being a racist, and a number of other accusations that have been leveled at Donald Trump. And he's made some statements that have offended a lot of people, and as a result of those statements, people are literally raising hell. I've seen pictures of mobs smashing windows and actually attacking people over the election of Donald Trump. Well, Michael Moore, the filmmaker, and a congressman from Michigan, Debbie Dingell, I believe it is, made some very relevant comments with regard to why Donald Trump got elected, and I'll get to those just a little bit later. But I must say, in watching these protests erupt on television, I have to wonder about these protesters. That why are they protesting now when there have been so many existential issues in the past that should have sent people into the streets and yet did not? I remember September 2008 when the financial collapse began, and I turned on the television one morning and stock markets were crashing all over the world. It was the beginning of the financial crisis, and the United States was already in a state of recession, but the real financial crisis was beginning in September of 2008. Now, understand this about the stock market. When the stock market goes up, when you have a huge rally on the stock market and companies are doing well and the stock market goes up, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be good for regular everyday people. However, here's the other side of that. When the stock market crashes, then it's a good bet that things are going to get really bad for ordinary people. That's what happened in the crash of 1929, that October Black Monday, I believe it was October 29, 1929, and that's considered to be the beginning of the Great Depression. And people were actually jumping out of windows and committing suicide because the economic downturn that occurred was the worst anybody had ever seen. And it was a sign that people were really vulnerable in this age of industrialization, where the fruits of the industrial revolution had been realized, and now people had become less self-sufficient as far as building their homes, making their clothes, raising their food, and so forth, and had become dependent on industrial jobs, and were therefore more subject to the vicissitudes of business cycles, the ups and downs of things that happen in the stock markets, in the securities markets. And so the crash of 1929 signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. Well, there was a stock crashes all over the world in September 2008, and yet I never saw people, in spite of the horrible implications this held for the coming years, I never saw people take to the streets at that point. It seemed that people were very passive over this whole thing. And a couple of years later, after the worst of the Great Recession had actually passed, you did see a movement come along called Occupy Wall Street. But Occupy Wall Street didn't seem anywhere near as big as what we've seen since the election of Donald Trump. And in the early days of Occupy Wall Street, I remember hearing how disorganized it was, how these people just wanted to do their own thing. They didn't like leadership, and I remember thinking at the time, that's going to be the beginning of the end of Occupy Wall Street. And surely, it was. So much for Occupy Wall Street. And then in the spring of 2010, we were still in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and a lot of people were still unemployed, and a senator from the state of Kentucky, I believe his name was Bunning, decided to step in and block the extension of unemployment benefits to people who were unemployed. And he was just going to let those benefits run out. I forget whether it was a filibuster or a procedural vote or something in that nature, but he was going to block unemployment benefits. And I'm thinking, okay, people, this is a situation where people are going to take to the streets, because this is just unacceptable. So many people are hurting right now, and they're not getting jobs, and they're on this unemployment. He's about to cut off their unemployment. Surely there will be riots and protests all over the United States, and it didn't happen. People were very passive. They didn't do anything about it. Well, this extended unemployment program did continue for quite a while, but then in the fall of 2010, you had the off-year elections, and there was a very negative response to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And there was a wave election in which Republicans were able to seize control of the U.S. House. That's when the Tea Party came to power. And so in January 2011, the House of Representatives had a Republican majority. And when the unemployment, the extended unemployment began to run out, this time they just let it run out. And a lot of people who were still unemployed were just summarily cut off. Their benefits stopped. They still didn't have jobs, but their benefits just stopped. It ended. The extended unemployment benefits ended. And I thought, surely now people are going to take to the streets. This will be something that will send people into the streets. There'll be riots. There'll be protests. People are not going to stand for this. They won't let it happen. And they let it happen. People were very passive about it. Unbelievable numbers of people, I think well into the hundreds of thousands, I'm not sure how many, but it was a hell of a big number, ran out of unemployment after the Tea Party Congress came to power, and there were no protests. There was no public outcry, or very little. There was no taking to the streets. Where were the protests? Where were the general strikes from people who were working? Where was all the hell raising that should have happened? It didn't happen. And then later, in 2011, you now had this Republican House, and you had President Obama in the White House, and the time came when it was going to be necessary to raise the debt ceiling, because if they didn't raise the debt ceiling, the United States would default on the national debt. And we've just been through a Great Recession, but this default on the national debt would have produced something far worse than the Great Recession. It would have been, and that's hard to contemplate. That's hard to think about. It would have produced something far worse than the Great Recession, more like the Great Depression. And it would have been a situation where people might actually have starved to death in very large numbers, and lost houses, and ended up homeless, and all kinds of horrible things would have happened if they had defaulted on the national debt. And yet, where were the protests? People were very passive about it. They just sat around, did nothing. And then, you know, one of the big issues in the 2008 campaign was health care, and so President Obama was going to have a health reform law. And so this thing hung up in Congress, and it turned out not to be so great when it was finally done, because an awful lot of people ended up not being eligible, and other people had ended up having trouble paying their premium. So Obamacare turned out not to be such a great thing. And, you know, but while the healthcare fight was going on in 2009, you didn't see people protesting, wanting to force Congress into action. There were no protests to try to get, you didn't see demonstrations and protests and riots trying to get the healthcare law passed. 35,000 people a year died for lack of health insurance, but you didn't see these huge protests. And people were very passive about it. Now, you did see some protests on the conservative side. The Tea Party was raising hell. But, you know, people did not protest for the health care law. And then this debt ceiling thing came up again in 2013. And the Republican House got very close once again to defaulting on the national debt. And I can't emphasize this enough. If they had done so, if they had allowed the country to go into default, it would have been, more than likely, Great Depression 2. That's how serious this thing would have been. But people didn't take it serious. People didn't take to the streets. People didn't protest. And so this history in recent years that you have in the United States is you have these great big huge existential issues, and people are just very passive about it. They don't riot, they don't take to the streets, they don't protest, they don't do demonstrations. They just more or less let it happen. I remember 2010 was an election year when this guy Bunning was blocking unemployment benefits, and there were people, I was in Alabama at the time, and there were people who were running for state office, Democratic candidates, and I actually suggested to some of them, Miranda Joseph, a woman who was running for state auditor, and a fellow who was running for Secretary of State, and others. And I said, this could be a huge issue for you guys. You guys could make headlines by hosting unemployment rallies all over the state and rallying the people against what's happening in Washington with the unemployment benefits. And, they took the suggestion, they didn't do anything with it. Terrible shame. And then they got beat. The Democrats didn't win one single office that year because they didn't take on an issue that was really important to people at that time. So years go by, you have these great big huge issues that are extremely serious, and people die because of these issues, and people get homeless because of these issues, and people suffer with chronic diseases and all kinds of horrible things, and yet people are just very passive. They don't do anything about it. Well, 2015, 2016 comes along, and Donald Trump starts to run for president, and he hurts some people's feelings. He hurts a number of groups' feelings, and then all hell breaks loose. I mean, it's good God Almighty, how can this guy be saying these things about this group and that group and the other group? So it wasn't the possibility of people starving to death that got people in the streets. It was the fact that Donald Trump hurt people's feelings with the things that he said. Now, I don't want to minimize the power of words. Understand this. I know that things that a presidential candidate and the leaders say, I know that can motivate people to do bad things, and I do take that seriously. I do understand that. But the thing that a lot of people missed with Donald Trump's victory ride to the White House was that people had concerns that were much greater than the situation with immigrants, that were bigger than, more important to them than Black Lives Matter, that mattered to them a lot more about whether Donald Trump was a misogynist or not, because there are a hell of a lot of misogynists in the United States. That's a very common thing, and I think a lot of people know that. But as Michael Moore and Representative Debbie Dingell of Michigan have both said, people elected Donald Trump because for years and years the working class in the United States has been stuck in these low-paying jobs. They've been struggling to make a living. They've been struggling to pay their bills. They haven't been getting ahead. They haven't been earning very much money, and they're sick and tired of it. And all they get from the administration is, well, we have globalism now, and you're just going to have to live with it, or you'll have to go back and get that bachelor's degree, in spite of the fact that bachelor's degrees are out of reach for most people in the United States now because of the cost. Look at the student loan crisis for evidence of that. But, so people elected Donald Trump because they were desperate for somebody to help them. And they wanted help wherever they could find it. And Michael Moore said that. He said that it wasn't all of these issues, these rather, what to a lot of people are peripheral issues. It was the fact that so many people struggled economically. Now, even Fox News, or Fox Noise as I like to call them, have publicized the fact that labor force participation is the lowest in the United States than it has been since the early 70s. Now, they like to paint this as people just not being willing to work, people just too lazy to work. What it actually means is that the jobs aren't there. If everybody who actually wanted to work was actually looking for work, then the official unemployment rate would be much, much higher than it is. But people are not looking for work because the work isn't there. And a lot of people who are working part-time jobs when they want full-time jobs. And a lot of the people who are working full-time jobs are struggling to get by. They're struggling to pay their bills. And they've been struggling for years. And they're tired of struggling. A lot of people who graduate from college get in a huge student loan trap, and they can't pay those loans back, and then they get in danger of default, and all kind of terrible things happen, and they don't see any relief coming as far as getting the pay up. And so people who have been stuck, sort of spinning their wheels in the mud for years and years now, that's what it's been for a lot of people in the workforce in the United States. That's what it has been for many years. They've been like an automobile stuck in a mud hole out in the wood, and they're just spinning their wheels, and they're trying to get out, and they can't get out, and they just keep on suffering, and they can't get their wages up, and they can't get their salaries up, no matter how hard they work, no matter how productive they are. They just keep falling behind, no matter how harder they work. As one person said to me one time, the harder I work, the behinder I get. And that's the way a lot of people feel, and they want relief. And to get them any relief, you've got to do a lot more than just tinker around with the periphery. Yes, health care is extremely important. It really is. And raising the minimum wage, as has been happening in Seattle, that's very important too. But you also have to find a way to support the working class, to help people earn the money that they need to earn to put food on the table and to have food, clothing, and shelter, and transportation, and health care. They need income. And the administration hasn't come up with anything to help people with income. I mean, the closest thing they came up with was infrastructure under the stimulus bill, and that was only temporary. You need a lot more of that, actually. But, people are desperate, and Michael Moore understands that. He says that people want to be able to earn money so that they can pay their expenses, so they can pay their bills. And they've been struggling with it for years, and they don't see any relief coming, and they didn't see any relief coming from Hillary Clinton, because it would have been more of the same with a gridlocked government. And so that's why people actually voted for Donald Trump. They voted for him because they were looking for help, and they were willing to take it from whomever they could get it. That's how desperate people have become, both in the workforce and out of the workforce. In spite of that low unemployment rate, people are struggling in low-wage, low-salary jobs, and they cannot get ahead. They just keep falling behind. Other people are not participating in the labor force because they can't find jobs at all. So you have an artificially low unemployment rate. And, considering these huge economic issues, which are not being solved, they're nowhere close to being solved, you would think that people would move past, whether Donald Trump is a misogynist or whether, he doesn't like this group or that group or the other group. The real issues are those economic issues. Now, does he have a solution to those problems? Well, two big holes in his plan are tax cuts and deregulation. That is definitely not going to work. It doesn't work in the poor southern states, and it won't work as a strategy for Mr. Trump. He does have some ideas. If they do a massive infrastructure bill, that might help. Renegotiating some trade deals, that might help. And controlling immigration more, that might help too, because the fact is illegal immigration does depress wages according to studies that have been done on it. So I'm sorry, but it just does, and I've actually seen that in action. But people finally did start protesting these economic issues, and that vote for Donald Trump, just like the vote in Greece for the left-wing party and just like the Brexit vote, was a protest vote. People finally had enough, and they want somebody to help them, and they don't care who that somebody is. They don't care if he's a misogynist. They don't care if he's a racist. They just want help. And that's what the election was all about. And so now, one thing you can say about this election in which Donald Trump got elected is finally people did begin to, at last, finally there has been a public outcry and public action over the economic realities faced by so many people. Whether it'll do any good or not, we'll see. But the thing with the vote is people have finally begun to protest against the issues that really matter. And the issues that matter aren't whether Donald Trump is a misogynist or a racist. The issues that matter is how do you help people earn a decent living when they've been struggling so hard for so many years. And so that's what the priorities ought to be. And regardless of what you think of the vote, that is, some people finally did get the right priorities. Got to say that much. Thanks and have a good day.